first for breaking news and the best live sport.
This is BBC 5 Live.
In a moment, we're going to talk to Anthony Brown from the industry group, the British Bankers Association. But first, Finn Travis-Smith, campaign manager of Move Your Money. Hi, Finn.
Hi, Rob.
When did you last change your bank?
I switched to Nationwide, I think about 2 months ago, to take advantage of their deal where you get £100 and the person referring you also gets £100.
Okay, are you happy with what the CMA has decided today, that the onus should be on us to switch our accounts rather than a more drastic measure like breaking up the banks?
Well, I think the CMA's investigation unfortunately misses an open goal for improving bank competition. The focus on switching is very narrow, and in fact there's been around 10 investigations into competition since the late 90s, all of which has focused on switching. Yet despite that, there's a wide awareness of how easy switching is, and yet switching levels are back down to what they were before the new switching rules came in. And, we think, as was mentioned by some of your case studies in the feature just now, that that's because there's no real difference between the main providers. It's like, it calls to mind Henry Ford's quote that you can have any colour car as long as it's black. All the banks are very much the same. They're all shareholders.
There are lots of new challenger banks in the market today offering new, sometimes innovative forms of banking. There are internet-only banks. The banking market's changed radically in the last few years.
Almost all banks that have come onto the new market are exactly the same type of bank. And what we actually need is more diversity of banks so that there's genuine competition between the way that they operate. If you look at the big four providers, they dominate more than 70% of the current account market. And even some of your case studies said that there's much of a muchness between them. What we need is a diversity of type so that we have banks that operate in different ways and offer very different products to make switching more appealing.
Do you think people would switch bank accounts to be 70 quid a year better off? It's not a huge sum of money, and many people think it's just a bit of a faff.
Well, £70 in a year is the same as 2p a day. So I don't think that the CMA's main line that £70 is a great offer will really, make much of a difference to the average person in the street. However, I do bring back to some stats that were released yesterday that show that 73% of the public are aware of the switching rules, and 78% said that it's easy to switch. So this focus on switching to solve competition is very narrow. What would actually solve competition is having different types of banks that offer in different ways. Otherwise, it's just doing more of the same and expecting different results from the CMA.
You see, it's going to be at least 6p a day, by the way, for me, not 2p a day, because I've got an overdraft. But do you think really that we want different types of banks? Isn't the point with banks that we trust them as they are? Even with all their faults, people choose the four main banks, like it or not, because they trust those brands with their money. It's not like switching electricity provider. This is cold cash we're talking about.
No, I completely disagree. If you actually look at the figures, banking has one of the lowest satisfaction and lowest trust ratings of all sectors. And in fact, what we're advocating is that if the CMA were to look at breaking up the banks into different types of banks, ones that take into account their stakeholders, that is the general public and society, then they would be offering services that are radically different, rather than the current model where banks just look at their shareholders increasing their share price and making as much money as possible. The way that this is playing out is that communities across the country are losing bank branches. People are getting ripped off with things like the PPI scandal because of the structure of these banks. They're set up to work in the interests of the bank and in the interests of their shareholders, not in the interests of society and people. So we say we should break up at least some of the banks, potentially RBS, as we already own it, so it should work for us, into banks that actually work for society and work in the interests of people. And that would be good for society and good for the economy too.